Ethan sat in the large chamber, with his hands pressed against his knees. He had been chosen to watch humanity fight, and he was not sure why. The watchers around him whispered to one another, speaking of the danger and recklessness of men and women who refused to bend. Ethan had heard the same story since childhood, that humans were fierce and unruly, that they would destroy themselves one day. Now it was his duty to see the truth with his own eyes and record every moment. When the call came for the first march, Ethan followed the soldiers through the camp. The air smelled of smoke and dust, and the sound of boots struck the ground like a drum. He met Claire at the edge of the camp. She was young, her dark hair tied back, her eyes steady. She carried no weapon but moved with the same pride as the soldiers. When Ethan asked why she was there, she answered simply, saying she wanted him to understand who they were. She told him that many outsiders thought humans fought without reason, but they always fought with purpose. Ethan was curious, though unsure if he believed her. As the battle began, Ethan stood on a ridge to watch. Below, men like Jason and Daniel lifted rifles and prepared their defenses. Megan carried supplies to the front line, her small frame weaving between the soldiers with speed and care. The enemy forces pressed forward, greater in number, their banners waving in the air. Ethan expected the humans to break quickly, but they did not. They fought with grit, holding their ground though each wave struck harder than the last. Ethan leaned forward, confused. He had never seen people fight this way. Jason shouted orders even as bullets tore past him. Daniel pushed back against men twice his size, refusing to fall. Megan dragged the wounded behind cover, then returned to the line without hesitation. Claire stood beside Ethan, her voice calm though her eyes shone with fire. She told him that humans were born into struggle, that they did not know peace as others did. Every loss taught them to rise again. Ethan tried to write this down, but the words shook on the page, for he did not understand how people could keep fighting with so little chance of survival. The battle raged into the night. Torches lit the field, smoke rising high above the camp. Men and women refused to sleep, building barriers with their own hands, tending wounds, and singing songs to keep one another awake. Ethan listened to their voices carry through the darkness, and it unsettled him. He had believed they were careless, yet here they were, turning despair into strength. Claire whispered that this was only the beginning, that he would soon see why the galaxy trembled at the name of humankind. Ethan looked once more at the soldiers below. They bled, they stumbled, but they did not yield. He saw a line of farmers who had taken up rifles, standing shoulder to shoulder with trained soldiers. He saw children running to bring water and bandages. He saw a will that no weapon seemed able to break, felt a chill run through him, for he began to suspect that Claire was right. This was not a people that would bow. This was a people who would burn brighter in the face of fear. And Ethan knew then that his task would not be as simple as writing a report. He was watching something far greater, something that might change the fate of every world. Ethan rose before the sun the next morning, the sound of voices and clanging metal filling the camp. Men and women worked without pause, sharpening blades, loading rifles, and building new barriers. Their eyes were heavy with little sleep, but their movements carried determination. Ethan followed Claire through the narrow paths between tents, watching as children passed buckets of water while elders prepared bandages. Every person seemed part of the struggle. No one was free from the burden of survival. As the sun lifted above the horizon, horns sounded from the ridge. The enemy came once more, stronger than the day before. Ethan climbed onto a wagon to see above the crowd. Soldiers like Jason, Megan, and Daniel took their places along the wall of sandbags. Jason stood tall, pointing to weak spots where the enemy might break through. Daniel checked the rifles of those around him, offering firm words that kept fear at bay. Megan rushed forward with crates of ammunition, her face streaked with dirt, yet she smiled at every soldier she passed, giving them courage in small but powerful ways. The clash began with thunder. Bullets and fire swept across the field and the earth shook beneath the charge. Ethan gripped the edge of the wagon, expecting to see the humans scatter. But instead, they braced as one body, shouting to each other, lifting one another up when someone stumbled. When a section of the wall fell, Jason led a counterstrike, charging with a handful of soldiers and pushing the enemy back long enough for others to rebuild the barricade. Ethan could hardly believe his eyes. These men and women fought as if they carried within them more strength than their bodies allowed. He glanced at Claire, who stood with her chin high, watching without fear. She told him softly that this was what it meant to be human. They were not the strongest or fastest, but they never stopped thinking, never stopped finding ways to resist. Ethan tried to understand. He looked back to the field and saw Megan tossing supplies to every corner where men called out for help, moving so quickly that she seemed everywhere at once. Daniel dragged 2 wounded comrades back to safety, then returned to the front without pause. The enemy pressed harder, yet the humans answered with greater resolve. Hours stretched on, and the ground was marked with blood and broken weapons. Yet the spirit of the fighters did not dim. Ethan began to see a pattern that unsettled him. When the enemy pressed forward with force, the humans bent but did not break. When they lost ground, they used the setback to plan a strike of their own. They did not fight with blind rage, but with clever hands and sharp minds. One soldier rolled barrels down a hill to scatter the charge. Another tied ropes between posts, causing riders to fall before reaching the wall. These tricks, small and desperate, turned the battle each time. As the day waned, the enemy withdrew again, leaving the field littered with wreckage. Ethan expected to hear mourning or cries of despair. Instead, he heard laughter around the fires as men and women shared food and stories. Children sang, their voices rising into the night sky. Ethan wrote quickly in his book, but the words were tangled. How could a people bleed so heavily and yet sing as if they had one? He asked Claire how they could laugh when so many had fallen. She answered that grief would come later, but hope had to live now, or they would not survive the next day. Ethan sat silently, staring at the camp as songs echoed through the darkness. He understood that the strength of these people was not only in their weapons, but in their hearts. He began to fear what it meant if such a people chose to rise beyond this battlefield. For if they could turn despair into hope here, then no force in the galaxy could ever truly defeat them. The third morning came with a cold wind, carrying the smell of ash from the past battles. Ethan walked through the camp, his eyes searching the faces of the men and women who had fought without rest. They looked worn, yet there was still a light in their eyes. The soldiers did not speak of surrender. Instead, they sharpened their blades and cleaned their rifles, as if preparing for another long day. It was then that Ethan heard whispers through the camp, whispers of the queen who would stand with her people. He followed Claire to the center of the camp, where a crowd had gathered. The queen stood tall among her men and women, not dressed in jewels or silks, but in armor marked with dust and blood. She held no crown, only a simple band upon her head, but the weight of her presence silenced everyone. Ethan stared in disbelief, for he had never seen a ruler place herself on the front lines. She did not speak of power or conquest. She spoke of family, of fields that must be protected, of children who deserved to live free. Her words struck deeper than the clash of weapons. They stirred the hearts of her soldiers, and even Ethan felt a chill as he wrote every word. When the queen walked among her people, she placed her hand on shoulders, looked into the eyes of farmers, workers, and soldiers alike. She called each by name when she could, and when she raised her sword, the entire camp answered with a roar. Ethan realized that she was not leading from above, but from within. She was one of them, bound to their fate. Claire leaned close and whispered that this was why the people fought harder than any others. They fought because they believed they were not alone. The enemy came again with greater strength. Their numbers filled the valley, their lines stretching far. Ethan climbed to his usual place, his heart racing. The queen stood at the front, her sword lifted high, her voice carrying across the field. Beside her stood Jason, Daniel, and Megan, ready for the clash. The charge began with a thunder that shook the ground, but the queen did not move back. She advanced first, leading the strike with her soldiers at her side. Ethan gripped his book so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could not believe what he was seeing. Jason rallied his men with fierce shouts, holding the left flank as waves crashed against them. Daniel fought near the queen, shielding her when arrows flew and striking with fury when enemies pressed too close. Megan darted between fighters, carrying supplies and guiding the wounded to safety, but she also raised her weapon when needed, never faltering. Ethan watched as the queen fought shoulder to shoulder with her people, her armor scarred, but her spirit unbroken. The sight shook him to his core. As the hours stretched on, Ethan realized this battle was different. The soldiers fought not only for their lives, but for the queen who stood with them. Their chants rose above the clash, their courage burning brighter each moment. When the enemy pressed hard, the queen lifted her voice again, and the soldiers surged forward with renewed strength. It was as if her presence filled them with fire. Ethan could see it in their faces. They would not break while she still stood. When the enemy finally withdrew, the field was a scarred plain of smoke and ruin. The queen stood tall, her sword lowered, but her head unbowed. Her soldiers gathered around her, weary but alive. Ethan wrote in his journal with trembling hands, recording what he had witnessed. He realized now that humans were unlike any he had ever studied. Their ruler did not command from safety. She bled with them, fought with them, and rose with them. He knew then why Claire had told him that outsiders would never understand until they saw it themselves. Humanity's strength was not only in their bodies or weapons, it was in their bond, their refusal to stand apart, and their will to fight as one. The days grew longer, and the fighting never slowed. Ethan no longer expected rest when the sun set, for he had learned that humans fought through night and day with little pause. He walked the camp at dawn and saw weary faces, yet the people still prepared. They built weapons from scraps, hammered broken metal into blades, and tied cloth around wounds that never had time to heal. Ethan could not understand how they endured so much, and still rose each morning, ready to fight again. When the horn sounded, the enemy stormed the valley with even greater fury. Ethan took his place on the ridge, his heart heavy with dread. He saw Jason leading a group of men to hold the narrow pass. The ground shook as enemies poured forward, but Jason never moved back. He shouted for his men to stand fast, and they did. When the wall cracked, he lifted his rifle and charged, pushing the fight back with sheer force of will. Ethan watched in disbelief. No matter how many pressed against him, Jason refused to fall. Near the camp, Megan ran through fire and smoke with children clinging to her arms. She carried them to safety, while still holding a rifle in her free hand. When she returned, she joined the line again, her body trembling, but her eyes unbroken. Daniel fought with brutal strength, charging into the thickest crowd to pull comrades free. He took wounds but did not stop, his voice rising above the clash as he called others to follow. Ethan gripped his book tightly, struggling to keep up with what he saw. These were not soldiers made of steel, or men and women of flesh, yet they fought like unbreakable stone. The queen herself strode into the fray. Her armor was dented, her sword stained, but she stood taller than all. When arrows struck her shield and knocked her down, she rose again. She raised her sword high, and her people roared louder than the thunder of battle. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had never seen a leader like her. She did not inspire with fear, but with courage, and her courage spread through every man and woman at her side. Each time she stood, the lines that had begun to bend grew firm again. Smoke darkened the sky as the battle raged on. Ethan's hands shook as he wrote, for he was seeing things no report could ever fully capture. Humans bled and fell, yet laughter still rang out between strikes. One soldier shouted a joke as he lifted a wounded friend. Another sang while swinging his blade, the sound carrying over the clash. Ethan could hardly breathe. He thought humans would fight grimly, yet they fought with fire in their hearts that nothing could quench. As the day dragged on, the watchers beside Ethan grew silent, their faces pale. They had come expecting to see weakness, but what they saw instead was something that shook them to their core. Humanity refused to yield. Ethan saw the fear in the eyes of the watchers as they realized the truth. If humans ever stood together beyond this battlefield, nothing could stand against them. The queen was struck down once more near the end of the day, her body falling to the earth. The enemy raised a cheer, thinking victory was at hand. But then, she rose again, lifting her sword with blood dripping down her arm. Her people roared with her, their spirits soaring higher than before. They pushed forward with renewed fury, breaking the charge that had seemed unstoppable. Ethan felt a chill run through his bones. No force in the world could crush such will. When the enemy finally retreated, the field was littered with broken weapons and the cries of the wounded. Yet the humans did not mourn in silence. They gathered their fallen, sang songs for them, and lifted their torches high as night fell. Ethan sat with his book open, unable to write another word. He understood now why the galaxy trembled at the name of humankind. It was not their weapons or their numbers. It was the spirit that refused to die, the fire that rose even from the ashes. The last dawn came with a heavy silence. Smoke hung in the air, and the ground was scarred with trenches and broken steel. Ethan stood at the edge of the camp, his chest tight with the weight of what he knew was coming. The final battle would decide everything. He looked at the men and women moving about, fastening their armor, lifting weapons patched with wire and cloth. They had little left, yet their faces held no fear. They were ready. Jason gathered his soldiers near the narrow pass once more. His voice was hoarse, but strong enough to carry over the camp. He told them that no matter what came, they would not yield. Daniel stood at his side, his hands still wrapped in bandages, but he gripped his weapon as if nothing could break his hold. Megan moved quietly among the soldiers, pressing water into tired hands, lifting the spirits of those who had lost family and friends. Claire stood with Ethan, her eyes never leaving the horizon where the enemy gathered in endless rows. The queen walked through her people before the battle began. Her armor bore scars from every fight, and her steps were heavy, but her gaze was steady. She did not hide her wounds, and the people saw in her strength the reflection of their own. She spoke only a few words, but they struck harder than any shout. She told them that today was not the day of fear, but the day of victory. For even if they fell, her spirit would live in those who came after. When she lifted her sword, the camp thundered with a cry that shook the valley. The clash began with fire and steel. The enemy stormed forward with all their might, but humanity met them head-on. Jason's voice rang out, calling his men to stand. He fought until his arms shook, yet he never lowered his weapon. Daniel charged into the thickest crowds, forcing them back with sheer force. He fell to his knees, 2 others lifted him, and together they pressed on. Megan moved through the smoke, pulling the wounded to safety, then returning again and again, refusing to rest. At the heart of it all stood the queen. Arrows struck her shield, blades cut across her armor, but she rose every time she fell. She did not lead from behind the lines. She charged at the front, her sword flashing in the firelight. Her people rallied around her, their voices rising as one. Each time she raised her sword, the line that had begun to falter surged forward with fury. Ethan could hardly breathe as he watched. He had thought he understood human strength, but this was something far greater. The field burned with smoke and cries. Men and women fought with broken weapons, with bare hands when nothing else remained. They used the ground itself, turning mud into traps, rolling stones down hills, setting fire to abandoned carts to block the path of the enemy. Every trick, every scrap, became a weapon. The more the enemy pressed, the harder the humans struck back. They fought with a fire that grew brighter as the darkness deepened. As the sun began to set, the final charge came. The enemy poured everything into one last push. Ethan thought the line would break, but the queen raised her voice above the chaos. She called to her people, and they answered with a roar. Jason stood, though his body shook. Daniel swung, though his arms bled, and Megan carried the last of the wounded, while still fighting her way forward. Together they pushed with the queen at their front. The charge broke, and the enemy fled into the fading light. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the torn banners. The humans stood among the ruin, their bodies scarred, their armor shattered, but they still stood. Torches were raised, voices lifted in song. Ethan closed his book slowly, his hands trembling. He understood now what the galaxy feared. It was not their weapons or their numbers, or it was this spirit, this refusal to fall. Once humanity chose to fight, no force could contain them. They would rise again and again, and the very stars trembled at the thought.